Good evening, everybody. Hans here, along with Angie, and we're really glad you tuned in tonight. This week, here on the Daily Dose, we're having a really important conversation. And that conversation is about faith and race. We've all witnessed over the last 2 weeks the things that have transpired since the just horrible death of George Floyd. And it's incumbent upon us to be talking about. This is an important conversation for us to have. So before we dive in today, I'm going to ask you to do something that seems sort of petty or meaningless, but it's actually really important. Would you share and like this post if you're watching on Facebook? Would you please be sure to do that so we can get the word out about this really important conversation? If you're watching at home on cable access, would you tell somebody else to tune in tomorrow? Because we're going to keep this conversation going through the end of the week. So we've been talking about this for a couple of days now. The first day, we began by inviting you into a conversation really around a question of us. What are our own experiences in terms of how did our families, the families we grew up in, our parents, our grandparents, how did they talk about people of color, about Black Americans? And then yesterday, we had a conversation about hurt and pain. And we've all experienced hurt and pain. That's our common experience as humans, I think. And so we invited you to have a conversation about your own hurt, your own pain. But then what do you imagine the pain to look like that Black Americans in our country experience each and every day simply because of the color of their skin? So Angie's going to keep the conversation going today.
Yeah, thanks, Hans. I thought I would start off first with this parable written by David Foster Wallace. And he talks about these two fish that are just swimming along, and they're kind of young fish. And then they happen to see an older fish swimming their way, who just kind of nods at them in their little fish body and says, "Morning, boys, how's the water?" And the two fish, they swim along for a little bit, and eventually one of the fish turns to the other and goes, "What the heck is water?" Friends, I think we are in this "what the heck is water" moment. I mean, there are some people who are like the older fish, who understand that we have been swimming in the waters of racism since the very establishment of our country. But then there are some people like the little fish who are now just swimming and realizing, oh my gosh, this is all around us. It's in our laws, it's in our culture, it's in the fabric of our society, it's in places that we had no idea. We're swimming in these waters of racism and systems that keep racism in place. And if we're honest, we don't always realize or see that that is true. It was a few years ago, and I was volunteering at a school when a little African-American girl, she fell down on the playground, and she skinned her knee. So sweet. And so I picked her up, and I wiped away her tears, and I brought her into the cafeteria so I could get her all bandaged up and cleaned up from this skinned knee. And I found the first aid kit, and I took it out, and I wiped off her knee with some disinfectant and some antiseptic, and then I grabbed a Band-Aid, and I put it on her knee. And as I put it on her knee, she looked down at the Band-Aid on her sweet, dark knee, and both of us, we looked at each other for this moment, realizing that something was off. That something was just quite not right. You could see her brain making connections. My brain at the same time, honestly, was making these same connections. You could see that we were just sort of trying to figure out what was off about this moment. You see, I put a Band-Aid here on my arm today, and you can see that this Band-Aid, it looks like my arm. It is my flesh color, and it's pretty close to my skin tone, and you couldn't even probably notice that I was injured unless I pointed it out to you. You see, this Band-Aid itself, it was made for people like me and for people like you. This Band-Aid, unless, of course, it's got superheroes on it or something like that, right? But this Band-Aid, like most bandages, most grown-up Band-Aids, they are made for people like me. They're made for people with whiteness. You see, there are examples all around us showing us about how America caters to whiteness. If you look at magazines now, and depending on the magazine, you typically have to get to page 8 or 9 or 10 before ever seeing a person of color. And when I go into the store, I went to a Walgreens this morning, I have no feelings about my race as I walk in. I don't have any trepidation. I don't even think about it at all. And I did some research. Books at bookstores that represent my children's race, only about 8% of children's books represent people of color or are written by people of color or been able to be published by people of color. 8% of what my kids are taking in. And when I sit down in a classroom to learn, I'm pretty much guaranteed that there'll be somebody in that classroom that looks kind of like me. And when I learned about history, I learned about white history in general, and I learned about how this was my heritage. And when we talked about other people's heritage, we called it civilization. We called it very differently. And me, as a white woman, I'm never asked to speak on behalf of my race. I've never had that experience where someone wanted me to speak on behalf of all of the white people. But people of color, they're often represented as the token person representing their whole race. I can't imagine how uncomfortable that has to be. And all the time, all why we don't even notice it, this is what we are swimming in. This is the water that is all around us. And friends, laws are made in this water, and policies are made in this water, and judgments are made in this water. Convictions are made in this water, and biases are made in this water. And some of us, maybe for the first time, like the little fish, are waking up to realize that we are surrounded in it, and that surprisingly, maybe it's in us too. So the Apostle Paul, he first started off his life as this guy named Saul, right?
Yep.
And he was a persecutor of Christians, and he jailed Christians, and he killed anyone who was associated with following Jesus. And he writes in the Bible, I can't talk today, in the Bible that he was really good at it, that he was zealous for the cause. He was excited to be able to do this work because he believed in Judaism so strongly. And he writes that he relentlessly persecuted Christians. But then one day he has this experience. And he is on the road to Damascus, and something strange, it happens to Saul. And he has this encounter with none other than who?
Jesus.
Jesus. And on this day, Saul, the Bible says, something like scales goes over his eyes. And he is blinded by this encounter. He's struck with a different understanding by this encounter with Jesus on the walk. And then God calls a disciple of Jesus named Ananias to go to Saul, the persecutor, to tell him about what it meant to be a follower of Jesus. Ananias is called to go further explain what they are doing. And honestly, Ananias, he didn't want to go. He didn't want to do this. I mean, this guy Saul, he was bad news. He was killing and persecuting people. I mean, can you imagine Ananias' fear as he walked into the room? But as he walked into the room, the Bible says these things like scales, they fell from Saul's eyes. And suddenly he was able to see with more clarity than he had ever had before. With this new vision to what the world was around him, this new purpose in Jesus. And at that time, he changed his name from Saul to, as we know him, Paul. And he was arguably the greatest advocate and evangelist for all time, for the very group that he used to oppress. So here's my challenge for you tonight and tomorrow. Let's let the scales fall off of our eyes and notice what is all around us. I mean, maybe you're like Paul, who saw it one way for a really long time, and it's all you've never known. But now, after what's going on, you're starting to see the world in a new way. Maybe you're like Ananias and you have seen the racism in our country for a while, and your call is to gently and kindly lead others to a new understanding. So friends, here's my questions for you tonight. The first is, what is something that you have learned to do differently as you got older? Or thought about differently. Maybe now you think about Band-Aids differently.
Forever,
Maybe you think about magazines differently or history differently. What is something that you have learned to see differently as you've gotten older? And the second question is, what are you curious about when it comes to race in America? What voices do you know that you probably need to hear? Or what do you want to learn about what's going on here today? Again, the second question is, what are you curious about when it comes to race in America? Friends, I want to encourage you to keep learning, to keep looking around, to keep asking God to change your sight or your perspective. I know none of us really gets it right, but we can at least keep learning and keep trying to work together. And I am hopeful that we can change what we are swimming in.
I love it. Angie, those are such wise words. and those questions. We intend for this to be conversation. And so we're going to challenge you now, today, have a conversation with someone in your home, call a neighbor, call a friend. What's something today that you see differently than you did when you were younger? How have you changed? And then the second question is this: what are you curious about when it comes to the life of Black Americans in our country? You see, this was meant, these daily doses this week, to be a part of a conversation. And if you missed out on the first couple of days, you can go out to our YouTube channel, you can scroll through Facebook. We want this to be a conversation. So maybe you go back and you start with day 1, which started on Monday. Folks, we're going to get through this. We're going to get through this with God.
With each other.
With each other.
You are a refuge. You have no borders. When I was a stranger knocking at your door, you took me in. With no questions and no conditions. When I was a sinner running from your grace, you called me friend. You called me friend. 'Cause there are no outsiders to your love. We are all welcome, there's grace enough. When I am wandered, Lord, your cross is the open door. There are no outsiders, and I'm not an outsider to your love. You are the harbor in every tempest. When my soul was shipwrecked, tossed upon the waves, you calm the storm. You are the Father, there are no orphans. Every tribe and nation gathered in your arms sings with one voice, sing with one voice. 'Cause there are no outsiders to your love. We are all welcome, there's grace enough. When I am wandered, Lord, your cross is the open door. There are no outsiders, and I'm not an outsider to your love. I was tired, I was bored, I was thrown upon your shore. I was homeless and afraid, till I heard you call my name. And now I'm ransomed, I'm restored, resurrected, I am yours. I am loved, yes I belong. Oh, my soul has found its home. 'Cause there are no outsiders to your love. We are all welcome, there's grace enough. When I am wandered, Lord, your cross is the open door. There are no outsiders, and I'm not an outsider. 'Cause there are no outsiders to your love. We are all welcome, there's grace enough. When I am wandered, Lord, your cross is the open door. There are no